Conservative TV personality Glenn Beck galvanizes thousands of right-wing Americans at a mass event in Washington. Is U.S. history witnessing a new radical movement that could steer the country in a different direction? Or is this simply a passing trend? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Garda. Tens of thousands of conservative Americans attended a rally at Washington's Lincoln Memorial. And the organizer, none other than TV personality Glenn Beck. Famous for his conservative views, Beck was accompanied by former Republican vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin. Nick Spicer reports from Lincoln Memorial.
They came by the busload from across the country. A predominantly white gathering.
Hello, America!
Heeding the call of this television and radio commentator, Glenn Beck.
For too long, this country has wandered in darkness, and we have wandered in darkness in periods from the beginning.
In a troubled nation in which many are looking for answers, the man who calls himself just an entertainer was offering a kind of solace.
God is the answer.
Sounding like a TV Moses.
Rights come from God. No government, no king.
But the timing of Beck's event, 47 years to the day after civil rights legend Martin Luther King made his I Have a Dream speech right at this place, sparked controversy and counter-rallies elsewhere in Washington.
So we're going to talk about Obama, the left.
Beck is the darling of the Fox News TV network. The populist presenter's on-air teach-ins on politics and his attacks on President Obama have won him a wide following on the right, as well as controversy, as when he called the United States' first black president a racist.
This president, I think, has exposed himself as a guy over and over and over again who has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture. I don't know what it is.
The second crowd favorite was Sarah Palin, the former Republican vice presidential candidate. But she kept the politics low-key.
We must not fundamentally transform America as some would want. We must restore America and restore her honor.
But if the language on the podium was cautious, made of simple patriotism and steering clear of open politicking, the feelings in the crowd were very political. There is much anger here about the direction the country is going in.
Everything is just completely corrupt. It's a corrupt system. They don't care about what we, the people, even care about anymore, or what we want, or what's good for the country. It's just become evil, in my opinion.
Overspending, shoving bills through the House, strong-arming, and not listening to the majority of the people.
Thousands of supporters of the grassroots Tea Party movement came to the rally. They say they're worried about heavy taxation and other things.
Because of all the ethnic groups that have come to America that don't really know what was so great about America.
Go to your churches, your synagogues, your mosque.
Glenn Beck avoided talking politics on Saturday, preferring to evoke the Almighty. But the big turnout at his rally is bound to energize politicians campaigning on the right in November's congressional elections. Nick Spicer, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, joining us now are our guests, all in Washington, D.C. Firstly, Phil Kerpen. He's Vice President of Americans for Prosperity. That was one of the groups that helped organize Glenn Beck's rally. Also with us, Faiz Shakir, Vice President of the Center for American Progress and Editor-in-Chief of thinkprogress.org. And we have Ari Rabin-Havt, Vice President for Research and Communications at Media Matters for America. Gentlemen, thank you, all of you, for joining us. Phil Kerpen, if I could start with you, what does restoring honor mean to you?
Well, just to clarify, we weren't a co-sponsor of the rally itself. We did have our national conference on Friday, and as a courtesy to our members, we did bus them down to the Glenn Beck event, which many of them were interested in. But we did not sponsor the event itself. And my understanding of what Glenn was doing with this Restoring Honor concept is that he was trying to honor the families of service members in the Special Forces who've been killed in combat and raise money for their families, to provide for the education for their children, and to see that their widows are taken care of. They raised raised over $10 million at the event yesterday, which I think is a considerable success on that front. And clearly, as you pointed out in the story, while the official event itself was non-political, there certainly was a lot of political feeling in the crowd, and there are people who are very concerned about the direction of the country right now. And a simple patriotic appeal has a broad-based reaction at the moment. You've got hundreds of thousands of people coming to Washington in order to show that they do believe in sort of a traditional patriotic sentiment, and I think that that does have political significance, though the event itself was non-political.
And you wholeheartedly back what Beck and Sarah Palin were trying to achieve?
Well, I mean, I think that our major focus at Americans for Prosperity right now is on fiscal and economic issues, ending runaway government spending, restoring government to a more limited size and more limited role in our lives. And I think that events like what Glenn did yesterday are helpful towards that end because they remind people about traditional American values. It's not directly within our mission because it was more, you know, the appeal to the military families and so on, which is not the economic stuff that we deal with. But I think that the sentiment is something that I can support in a broad sense. I don't obviously support everything that every person there had to say because you're always going to have some nuts at any large gathering. But the general sentiment of the event is certainly something I can embrace.
Ari Rabin-Havt, it was helpful to remind people about general wholesome American values. What do you think?
Look, I think we all support the idea of restoring honor. I made a contribution to the Special Operations Warrior Fund. I think they're a great charity, but I think there was an underlying political message. Sarah Palin took a thinly veiled shot at the president from the stage. It was extremely thinly veiled. I think Glenn Beck's event the night before had a number of speakers, such as Pastor John Hagee, who were outwardly political. And I think to say this wasn't a political event is ridiculous.
Faiz Shakir, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. If Americans for Prosperity was busing Tea Party activists who have been galvanizing against President Obama for the better part of the last year and a half here to D.C. to take part in a political rally. I mean, if this were an election year, in a presidential election year, I think you can consider what happened yesterday as a convention of sorts. It was President Glenn Beck with his Vice President Sarah Palin taking the stage and talking in lofty rhetoric, but in fact they were talking to hardcore activists, people who are really upset with President Obama. And I think that my concern with it is that people like the Americans for Prosperity, like Glenn Beck, are taking advantage of people who are in economically distressed circumstances, feeling like the country isn't going in the right direction, and they're feeding them a lot of nonsense, a lot of mistruths, a lot of exaggerations, a lot of lies, and this is coming from a leader who's called the president racist, Glenn Beck. So I think that the whole leadership of this movement is one to be suspect of.
Yeah, let's broaden this out and talk a little bit more about race. Glenn Beck's rally was heavily criticized for being held on the anniversary of the March on Washington. Reverend Al Sharpton and other civil rights leaders have been commemorating that event. Monica Villamizar attended their rally also in D.C.
United in song, marking the 47th anniversary of Martin Luther King's most inspiring speech.
You decide you want to hate me, fine. But don't try to persecute me because of your hate. And so, peddling hatred, blacks, Latino, Arab, it's the universality of humanity. We have to dispel that.
Well, we're here in Dunbar High School, and the crowd here, although smaller in size from what you have seen in other parts of Washington, is definitely as energized about why they are here.
For some, it was more than a commemoration. It was an obligation with history to teach young generations about the struggle for African-American civil rights.
Somebody said, "Why are y'all marching? Why are y'all rallying? They call us troublemakers." But now the folks that used to criticize us for marching, trying to have a march themselves.
The crowd marched to the National Mall, arriving just after a huge Glenn Beck rally was over. Still, the two groups did briefly meet.
What is that? That's not right. We have 90% of the crowd. You guys have 10%.
We promote Martin Luther King.
He's asking me why am I saying about being a racist. Well, Glenn Beck called our president a racist, and he said that he has a problem with the white culture, okay? He's the racist himself.
Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated 5 years after giving his famous speech. His son, Martin Luther King III, was 8 at the time. He told me the dream of equality has not yet been achieved.
You know, you can't hijack a message. And you know, what I saw of Glenn Beck, they paid an incredible tribute to my dad.
So you think things haven't changed?
Do I think things have changed? Oh, things have changed dramatically. I mean, you know, the fact that we have an African-American elected president, but that does not mean that racism is gone yet.
God bless you. Reclaim the dream.
Monica Villamizar, Al Jazeera, Washington.
So that was the counter rally. Ari Rabin-Havt, how important was it that those led by Reverend Al Sharpton held the other rally and made their voices heard?
I think what's important is we keep in perspective what Dr. King's dream was. Glenn Beck clearly, his vision is not in line with Dr. King's. Dr. King stood for social justice. Glenn Beck claims that people who support social justice are akin to Nazis and communists. Dr. King supports economic justice. Glenn Beck is adamantly opposed to it. The idea that Glenn Beck could have the mantle of Dr. Martin Luther King is frankly ludicrous.
So Phil Kerpen, on the 47-year anniversary of the famous speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you would agree to a certain extent, given such resentment from many people, particularly African Americans, at the choice of this timing and venue, that it dishonors Dr. King, doesn't it?
Well, I think dishonor would be too strong a word. And Glenn says that he picked the date without knowing it was the anniversary of King's speech. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I will say that Al Sharpton has made an entire career of race hustling, race hucksterism, of playing on racial differences, going back to Tawana Brawley and Crown Heights. I mean, episode after episode of trying to exploit race differences to promote himself. Clearly, we've seen Glenn do a little of that with the comments you played earlier about the president, but none of that was present at Glenn's event yesterday. Glenn's event yesterday was not about race. There was no mention of race in any of the official program. It really was about judging people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And in that sense, I think it's consistent with the most significant and most well-known takeaway from the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech.
Do you find no problem with the fact that there were very few or hardly any non-white people at that rally?
Well, I don't think that's accurate, first of all. I mean, I actually didn't go down to the mall yesterday, but from the photographs I've seen and from the crowd at our own Americans for Prosperity event Friday, I can tell you that all races are represented in the Tea Party movement. I'd be quite certain that all races were represented down on the mall yesterday. And I know that Project 21, a project of a number of conservative black leaders, specifically supported the event being held on the anniversary and were in attendance. So I think that that is an overgeneralization. And I would point out that it was the counter rally, the protest that was led by Sharpton, that had explicitly racial content, that was constantly having speakers attack Glenn Beck, use issues of race. That was the racially motivated event of the two that happened yesterday. Glenn Beck's was simple patriotism. And so I think that if we're going to take seriously the idea of being in sort of a post-racial moment, we've elected a biracial president of the United States, I think that's very significant, then I think that we need to get past some of these hang-ups about race. Certainly Glenn has gone past the line and made a mistake with those comments, but those were over a year ago, and it's the other side now that's being critical of him that seems to be obsessed with race at the moment.
Faiz Shakir, the other side is obsessed with race, not Glenn Beck and his supporters. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a lot of nonsense. I think if you've watched the conservative movement over the past few months, you've seen them galvanize into action against the mosque in New York City. You've seen them hold similar angry protests about mosques in California and Tennessee and Florida and Texas. You see that there's an immigration debate playing out in Arizona and a whole host of other places. They're just people who are angry over the concept of people who may not look or sound the same as they do, and the Americans for Prosperity, Glenn Beck, are taking advantage of them by preaching to them social discord. I mean, Phil doesn't want to acknowledge it, but Glenn Beck continues to prey on race. He's been using it for the past few months, in fact. He said that President Obama didn't want to meet with the head of BP because the head of BP is a white man. That's what Glenn Beck said. So I think that this is the type of politics that Glenn Beck tries to play. He sows discord in our society, and he's a terribly divisive leader in that way. And of course, you wouldn't make any excuses for the fact that there are a lot of African Americans who are upset with Glenn Beck, and they were expressing that disappointment yesterday.
Phil Kerpen, you mentioned that your organization, Americans for Prosperity, are mainly concerned with the economic situation in the United States and the issue of money, opposing the bailouts, opposing universal health care, etc. Don't you feel that the likes of Glenn Beck and Sarah Palin are actually doing you a disservice by making a caricature of all the things you claim to stand for?
Well, I think that they're both figures who are very polarizing, and at times when they do cross the line into sort of social commentary that can be highly divisive, I think that's not helpful. But at the same time, they're also driving an enormous number of folks to look at the very serious economic issues that we face as a country right now. And so I think that when they do that, they're very helpful and very productive. We face unprecedented economic challenges right now that are being exacerbated by failed government policies, by a failed stimulus policy, by an enormous new health care law, by any number of interventions in the economy that are making it impossible for businesses to know what normal looks like and to start investing and hiring again. And that is the real challenge of our times. The overwhelming majority of voters this cycle will be concerned first and foremost and perhaps exclusively with economic issues. And so that's our focus. And I think that Beck and Palin, to the extent that they speak to that, and they do often speak to that, they're helpful in that goal, but they sometimes get off on some of these other issues. You know, I actually agree that the people who've been talking a lot about things like the mosque and immigration and other subsidiary issues are not being helpful towards the goal of getting the country turned around on the big picture economic issues. I think that we need to focus like a laser on the economy and on the failed fiscal and economic policies of this administration.
Ari Rabin-Havt, are the other issues the subsidiary issues, as Mr. Kerpen mentioned, and the major issues are bailouts, high taxation, healthcare reform, and are those subsidiary issues derailing the process of looking at the major economic issues?
Look, I think yes, unemployment, the economy, those are the major issues facing people every day. And the conservative movement right now is being led by a self-proclaimed rodeo clown holding an event on the Mall. I think, you know, and the people at Fox News, like Glenn, like Sean Hannity, like Bill O'Reilly, are distracting America with false stories about the mosque and about Shirley Sherrod and Van Jones, and distracting America from the real issues. And frankly, people like AFP have been a part of that.
And are they making a caricature of the entire Tea Party movement? Are they creating their very own straw man?
I think they are, and I think they're building up these characters who work to divide America and work to divide us as a people by race, by economic classes, by social status, and it's just wrong, and people like Phil should condemn it.
Faiz Shakir, I know you don't respect Glenn Beck and you don't have too much time for the Tea Party movement, but how influential can they possibly be? Because you've got the November midterm elections coming up ahead. Do you fear their power or potential power?
No, you have to take it absolutely seriously, and people like the Americans for Prosperity, who are funded by a lot of oil money behind them, have the resources to galvanize into action. A lot of these people, as Phil said, they're busing people here into D.C. For a lot of the people we talked to yesterday who were attending the rally said that they came for free, didn't pay a dime out of their pocket. So that's the kind of movement that I give credit to the Americans for Prosperity for trying to build action around, and they're going to be a threat, that's for sure. I think my problem with them is not that they're participating in democracy. My problem is that they're feeding them a lot of misinformation. I mean, even if Phil wants to have an economic discussion, let's talk about the fact that President Bush was responsible for a lot of the huge deficits that we now face. It was his tax cuts, it was his wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was his failed economy that he left office with that are responsible for the vast majority of the deficit we now face, and President Obama is trying to turn that around. And he's not, I mean, of course he's got a very difficult hand to deal with, but it's the mistruths, the exaggerations, the lies that you continue to hear from people like Phil, from people like Glenn Beck, who want to try to prey on people who are looking for a reason to scapegoat, a reason to blame somebody else for the problems they may be currently facing.
Phil, you want to respond?
Yeah, let's be clear, because there's some accusations in there from both of our fellow panelists that are a little bit personal towards me. When you start to say that my organization, Americans for Prosperity, is doing anything other than work on the economic issues and work on fiscal and economic responsibility in this country, it's simply not true. We've never weighed in on any of these social issues. We don't have a position on those.
You bust people to the Glenn Beck rally.
We brought people to our own conference. We brought people to our own conference on Friday, our annual Defending the American Dream conference, a 100% economic agenda. And as a service to them, we brought them down on buses from our conference hotel down to the mall a couple of miles to save them the inconvenience of walking those couple of miles. I think that's a reasonable thing to do for member services. I don't think that that has a lot to do with promoting any other issues except for the ones that we do in fact care about. We have been extremely critical of President Bush, especially on the spending issue, which we think is the overall driver of the bad fiscal situation right now, far and away the far larger driver of deficits than the revenue side. And we've been critical of President Bush for when he was president. We did a national tour criticizing earmark spending in particular and overall overspending. We were extremely critical of the Medicare Part D benefit. We have been consistent opponents of big spending, big government. We are now resonating in a way that has never happened before, but that's because the American people are now overwhelmingly concerned about the growth of government, and that's the real story of this election cycle. And in my view, that's the real story of the Tea Party as well. Far and away, it's the fiscal and economic issues that they're concerned about.
Ari Rabin-Havt, do you think that if Congress does...
Phil...
okay, why don't you respond to Phil first, and then I'll ask you afterwards.
Yeah, Phil, let's be honest about the real story of AFP. The Kochs give you guys money. They get fined by the EPA. You lead a national bus tour against EPA regulation to promote the poisoning of people through carcinogens in the air. Let's just be honest about your economic agenda.
And you support George Soros' moratorium in the Gulf so that Petrobras can get our offshore drilling equipment. Give me a break. Look, I could
Media Matters takes no
your
policy
motives
positions
just as
at all.
easily based on who your donors
Go
are.
impugn my motives. George Soros has never given Media Matters a penny. Never given us a penny.
So you say you get it through the Tides Foundation. We know how it works. My point is, we can impugn each other's motives all day long talking about donors, but I understand, as you should, that you guys say the things that you believe and you act on the things that you believe, and you go out and try to raise money from people who agree with you.
So you believe
we do exactly the same thing. I have never taken any position that I don't agree with.
You believe that organizations should be allowed to poison people?
No, I don't. But I also don't believe that the EPA should be shoehorning greenhouse gas regulation into a 1970 law that could potentially shut down all economic activity in this country. I think that Congress needs to deal with the greenhouse gas issue.
Where do you stand on global warming? Do you not think we have a climate crisis right now?
I think we're going down a different route here. I want to rein it back for a second. And, Ari Rabin-Havt, I want to ask you, at those midterm elections, if Congress does swing to the right, if the Republicans are successful, do you think the Tea Party will take the credit for it?
I think credit in elections is a really hard thing. I think a lot of people will jump up and take the credit for it. I actually think, speaking as a person, I'd like to thank the Tea Parties as a progressive. I think by nominating candidates like Rand Paul and Sharon Engel, they've actually helped Democrats in the fall. So speaking as a progressive, thank you guys.
Faiz Shakir, final question for you. Do you think that these ideological fault lines are real or perceived as witnessed here by the Glenn Beck rally and the counter rally and this very discussion?
No, it's absolutely real. There are people who have deep-seated disagreement about the future of the country. All I'm asking for is a respectable and honest debate. What I have the biggest problem with Phil's and with Glenn Beck and a variety of other leaders of the conservative movement right now is that they don't want to agree on a basic set of facts and then suggest that off these basic set of facts we can have a disagreement over policy. It's that they want to impugn the facts themselves and make them up. And I think that that's the biggest concern. And in addition to that, sowing social discord in our society. I know Phil respectably doesn't want to have anything to do with it, but of course there are people within his movement who are trying to tear apart America at the seams, trying to pit one against the other on the basis of color of skin, on the basis of their last name, on the basis of what religion they adhere to. And that's the kind of thing that is very dangerous beyond the midterm elections, and I think something we should all be concerned about.
Gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure talking to all of you. Thanks to all of you, Phil Kerpen, Faiz Shakir and Ari Rabin-Havt. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments, your suggestions, or your questions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.